be found off of computer records, not necessarily on scene. It changes the relevance aspect of it, and as far as what the state's intention is, and they, of course, would at that point be hearsay statements.
So you're objecting to mention of the contents of emails?
Yes.
Further, Mr. Prince?
I would just make the point, I don't know that it's relevant at all whether they're on the computer or found printed off in paper form at the scene. I mean, it's the same thing. There's not a question as to the authenticity of the emails that they're from Brandy Peters. That issue isn't in dispute. As I mentioned before, they are relevant, as the court said, to her state of mind, I suppose, on the way to proving what she was actually involved in, introducing circumstantial evidence of what she was actually involved in. And whereas the court is absolutely right, the victim's state of mind is not ordinarily relevant because it doesn't bear on the defendant's intent to kill her. In this case, the defense is that she was engaged, intentionally engaged in conduct and with people that presented a threat to her life and her kid's life. That's why it's relevant, whereas it's not in a normal proceeding. I would further make the point with respect to hearsay that, again, what's being asserted in these emails is that the money is not worth the risk, that she needs to talk to Kayla. We're not trying to prove she needs to talk to Kayla. We're not trying to prove whether the money is worth it. That's what she's asserting. That's not what we're trying to prove. We're trying to prove that she's involved through circumstantial evidence, through her acknowledgement of the danger. We're trying to prove she knows she's involved with dangerous people, different than what's being asserted.
Well, it's a very complicated case, very complicated facts. At this point in time, I'm going to sustain the state's objection. It's not a final ruling. I'll make a more defined ruling later, but it seems to me it's going to the victim's state of mind, which is not relevant. That's a preliminary ruling, and we're just not going to get into the substance of the emails. I would agree with the defense that whether they're found in the house or found on the computer is not necessarily significant. I said that was only significant if that meant the state was not objecting. I don't see where that changes my analysis any. So let's not get into the substance of the emails at this point in time. Anything else?
No, Your Honor.
Anything else? No. And I believe there was a request that I make media inquiry each morning.
Yes.
I'll try to remember to do so. If I forget, you'll need to remind me. All right, let's have a jury, please. We'll start with the state of Florida. Mr. Pugh.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, can I actually turn on my speaker, please? Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to start off by thanking you. I know, Artie, I thank you for when you were called for jurors and paying attention to myself and Mr. Prince through the jury selection process. As I mentioned back then, we obviously cannot do this without you. I'm thanking you now because you're no longer potential jurors. You are, in fact, the jury. You're selected by myself, my co-counsel, as well as Mr. Prince and Mr. Segura and his co-counsel, because we felt that you were the best to try this case, listen to us throughout the long trial that's before you. So I'm thanking you very much for doing so in advance, because I'm confident you are, in fact, going to do that. As the judge has explained, Your Honor, if you can put it on podium 8, on attorney 8, please, and then send all. Should say send all, you know. I'm sorry? No, I can do it. All right, sorry about that. We ran through it beforehand to make sure it worked, and of course, as computers worked years ago, sometimes you have some problems. Obviously, you were here today for State of Florida versus Henry Segura. What the judge explained to you at this point is what opening statements are, an opportunity for the attorneys to tell you what it is that they expect you to hear about the course of the trial. And of course, what I'm going to explain to you how the state created the evidence, or not created, but came up and investigated this particular case, found the evidence, and ultimately charged Mr. Segura with this particular crime. So let's talk about this. What you're going to hear is back on November 20th of 2010, law enforcement officers were called out to 908 South Creek Run. They were called out there for a welfare check by a friend of Mrs. Peters, Brandy Peters. You're going to hear that this is located in the southeastern side of Tallahassee. You can see the fairgrounds are right here. We have Jack McQueen Park, Capitol Stadium. This is Tram Road, 4 Points, and then heading out this way on Avenue and Redstone Road. This is the location of the home. What you're going to hear, this is of course the home of Brandy Peters. Her 6-year-old twins, Tamaya and Nana Peters, and her 3-year-old son, Javante Segura. Again, you're going to hear that law enforcement officers responded to this scene. And who you're going to hear is that Officer Jernigan responded as well as Officer Kidd initially. They approached the home. They were able to see blood on the outside. This was consistent with the phone call they got. And what you're also going to hear is that C.C. Timmons, who is a friend of Mrs. Peters, had been talking to Brandy the night before. And since that time had never been able to get her on the phone. This was unusual because usually they go back and forth, they talk on a regular basis. But for some reason on that particular morning, Miss Peters was not responding. Now you're going to hear that Miss Timmons was actually at work, so she called her son, Artron Timmons. And Artron Timmons went over to the home, and he went to the home, and he was able to see blood on the outside of the home. Obviously, as anybody else would, he realized it was a problem. So he called his mom. Mom subsequently called law enforcement. Law enforcement officers respond. And they come up and they approach the home. And what you're going to hear is they try the door, and the door's locked. Can't get in. But they also see the porcelain carpets over here. They find out there's blood here on the side of the home. So at this point, they're a little alarmed, and they break the window in order to gain entry. They break this right-hand window right here. And you're going to hear that officers reach in, and they unlock the door, and they open the door, and you're going to hear what they found. Around Brandy Peters right there. You're going to hear that they were joined by Officer Wyman. Officer Wyman has training experience. He's actually former in the United States Army. He actually takes what they would call point or lead. And the three of them proceed to what they call clear the house. Clear the house is a situation in which they go through the house and they make sure nobody's in there. They may be still alive at this point. It was readily apparent that Peter was not alive, so they would not be able to help her. But they want to go through and make sure that there's not somebody else there that may be still struggling, holding on to life, or what have you, or maybe even possibly the person that did this. So they're going through and they're clearing the house, and they go through room by room by room to make sure of that. And as they go room by room by room, they find Tamaya, and Javante. You've been by the word. They fall on wide all three of them.
Put it on the street.
I am. So now the question is, what happens next? Once they get done clearing the house, They pull out of the house. They start preserving the house for purposes of the crime scene. They put up that tape that you saw earlier to make sure nobody can come in. They contact the investigation division, the investigators. These are the people that are trained in the course of these investigations for homicide in this particular case. And they come in and they start doing what it is that they do. What you're going to hear is that investigator Mark Lewis is the person that has been assigned to the case, and he becomes the lead investigator. Now, what a lead investigator means is, doesn't necessarily mean that he does everything involved in the case. What it means is he's kind of the ringleader. He coordinates. It's almost like the head coach of a football team. He coordinates and tells the other people, if you will, the assistant coaches, what to do, how to do it, come up with ideas, and kind of helps put it all together and make sure and directs traffic, if you will, as far as how the case proceeds. In addition to that, they also call the crime scene investigation team. In this particular case, Annie Pressey is the primary crime scene investigator. There are multiple people that do in fact respond in addition to her because of the severity of this particular case. What you're also going to hear as part of the course of action is that they assign essentially investigator was assigned essentially another investigator, April DeBravo, who is now April Wilder, is another crime scene detective. She's an investigator, not a crime scene investigator. But she is liaisoning in there and working the scene with Mrs. Pressey as well as other persons that are involved in the crime scene. And you can hear why that is. The reason behind that is because each and every single day, and Investigator DeBravo and Wilder will tell you that part of the thing is, as they proceed through this investigation, each and every day they meet up. You know, you've got investigators going here, doing this, doing that. You hear throughout the course of this the different kinds of things that are going on. So it's very important for somebody to be basically a liaison between the crime scene investigators and the rest of the investigative team, so they can tell them what they've been getting at the crime scene and what came from the crime scene and things along those lines, in order that they can figure out what their next moves are going to be as they progress through this investigation. As we mentioned in opening statement, in jury selection, this is not a 1-hour CSI episode. This is a long, drawn-out process. And in fact, there were multiple days at this particular crime scene. It wasn't just one day. So the next thing you know that they're going to do is process a scene. What does that mean? Processing the scene, they go in and they take photographs. The first thing they do, though, is they take a video. And they go through with a camcorder and they video record everything as it is, as they found it. Now, at this point, you have law enforcement officers that, of course, have come in and cleared the scene. But other than that, everything else has been preserved because they immediately withdrew once they cleared the scene. They preserved it. You can hear from those law enforcement officers that are going to tell you that. And they preserved it so that way it's as original as it possibly could in those circumstances. They take a video. The next thing they know, they go through and systematically go through the home. And they started in the back of the home. And they work their way forward. In the back of the home, you'll hear there's a back door down the initial hallway. Then on to the right is Brandy Peters' bedroom. There's an attached bathroom to it. There's also a room off to the left that the girls shared. And then there's another room that Javante Segura shared as well. On top of that, there is directly across the hall from Javante Segura's room is a bathroom. That was the bathroom that you were found in. Then subsequently you back out, and as you first enter the door, there's the kitchen to the right and the living room to the left, and of course the small entry area that you saw. So they take photographs of the entire scene. Then as they systematically go through this house, they take pieces of evidence they find. And you're going to find that you're going to hear that they found spent bullets at multiple locations, both in Brandy Peters' bathroom, as well as in the hallway directly across, and there's a closet there with the door directly across from her bedroom. You're going to hear that they found a phone that had been ripped out of the wall, an earring laying next to that particular phone. You're going to hear that throughout the entire house there's blood, what they call blood spatter. Blood spatter is essentially what is from an injury, it's projectile. You're going to hear at the doorway, as you leave Randy's bedroom and go into the hallway, there's a smear of blood right there at the entryway. And what you're going to hear is that they've collected all these, they swabbed each and every one of those, and of course they processed the bathroom that we previously saw. They're looking for fingerprints, they're looking for blood evidence, they're looking for trace evidence. They even worked all the way outside to the blood that we talked about that was at the front door, and they took swabs of that. That's how they go about processing the scene. And of course, ultimately, they have to remove the victims. Victims are taken to the medical examiner and processed for an autopsy. What happens next? They start asking questions. They start with family. Who does she know? Why is this important? You can hear from investigator Mark Lewis, who's gone to multiple different homicide schools. He's an investigator with the Dallas policeman for a long period of time, and he still is employed there. You're going to hear that this is very important because when you have a situation, what the schools have taught them is when you have a situation in which there was a beating and a victim who was subject to the wounds that Randy Peters was, many times it's someone they know. It's also important in this particular case because if you recall, the doors are locked to the house. There was no sign of forced entry other than, of course, what the law enforcement officers had to ultimately do to gain entry. So it's very important to know who it is that she knows. It also helps build a profile. Who is Randy Peters? Build that profile up and talk about who Randy Peters is. This is important in many ways because we're trying to figure out when this occurred. We know when they're found. We got to figure out when the homicide actually occurred. Because of course, if you're looking for suspects, you need to find out where they were at the time of the homicide. It's fundamental 101. So we've got to establish a time frame. We're talking to family members. When they ever talked to them last? And of course, the general information and habits. Again, that goes towards just what we talked about and why that's important. So you talk to the friends, you talk to the family, talk to the neighbors. See anything? Do you hear anything? Who should know why is important? And of course, once again, we're trying to establish a time frame. And what you can hear is law enforcement officers did that thing. They went out there and canvassed the neighborhood. Nobody heard anything. Very strange. Gunshot, for some reason nobody heard anything. What you're going to hear is that law enforcement officers, as I said, had come back to the scene on multiple different times. One of the times they returned to the scene, and of course that question is one that you'll ask yourself, I'm sure, why would nobody hear these gunshots? And it's of course one that law enforcement officers are asking themselves as well. What you can hear is one time they came back to the scene and there was a big football game going on over there at Capitol Stadium. We talked about the proximity to Capitol Stadium a little bit ago. Band playing, things along those lines. They were standing outside the homes, and as they're talking to witnesses and stuff like that, they realize how loud it is. God, that's loud. The next thing, they go into the home. What? Couldn't hear. And thought to themselves, these homes are really quiet. Maybe that's why nobody heard anything. So after doing this, after talking to everybody, what they figured out was that Randy Peters was one who always had her cell phone around. We talked about that in jury selection. Randy Peters was one of those. She had her cell phone at all times. She was last seen on November the 19th, which was the day before. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, she had come home, she had picked up the girls. Archer on Timmons is going to tell you that he saw them eating Burger King around that time period. And they went back to their home. We know how the bodies were discovered because our crime team and CC teams called for a welfare check. Our guys know, boyfriends, and we also figure out that the children have three different fathers. Tamaya and Tanaya have their fathers, Antonio Anthony and Javante Peter. His father, his name is Segura. One of the other things they do, we talked about this, a couple people did, during jury selection, is they also go back and they look at Randy's phone, and they get cell phone data. In this particular case, she has a Sprint phone, and they go in and they look at it, and they can find content in certain situations about what her phone is, and what messages were sent, things along those lines. What we find out is that between 6:11 and 6:52, Randy was talking to her mother on the phone. At 6:53, she receives a text from CC Timmons, and she responds to it. This is the last, what they call active communication on the phone. As it relates to phone records, there's a difference between active and passive. Active would be the person that is using the phone, sending out a text message, using a data entry, where they're actually manipulating the phone and doing something with the phone to show that somebody's actually holding that phone and doing something with it. A passive would be an incoming call that's not answered, an incoming text that there's no response to, for whatever reason. So at 6:53 is our last active communication on Brandy's phone in which she was utilizing it. At 7:13, we have a passive event. It means that she wasn't actually using the phone, or whatever it is, did not respond. At 7:49, we have another passive event. And then at 8:21, we have what we call a routed event. And you're going to hear from investigator Chris Corbett. Chris Corbett is a trained person as well in analyzing cell phone data. And he is going to explain to you, in addition to this information, what routing events are, what passive events are, how to read these particular records that we're talking about, and what they show. And when there's a routed event, what he's going to tell you is that that is an indication that the phone has been powered down and is no longer communicating with any towers at all. It's not working, for whatever reason. So at 8:21, she stops communicating at 6:53, and the phone is powered down at 8:21. And when you take all of it together, law enforcement officers start to wonder whether or not this event happened between 6:53 and 8:21 on November 19, 2010. So what they do is, as I said, they always kind of meet together and they figure out where they are as it relates to each aspect of the investigation. Of course, Chris Corbett is a part of this, so he's telling them the information he's found from the cellular phones. Of course, what you're also going to hear is there was an autopsy conducted on the kids and Randy, and that during the course of the autopsy, one of the things that they do is they send an investigator there as well. So once again, they can come back and relay to the team. And you can hear Dr. Lisa Flanagan is the person that performed the autopsy. And what you're going to hear is, in the course of the autopsy, what she found was that inside the stomach of Tanaya was undigested food. And that undigested food is consistent with having been eaten within the past 3 hours. So when you take that in context with Arthur Timmons' testimony of seeing them eating Burger King approximately sometime around 4 to 5 o'clock in the evening. In addition to that, on scene, we found a Burger King receipt where Burger King was bought around 4:30 in the evening. Now we have the undigested food that that was eaten within the past 3 hours. And then you take another look back at the home, and you see over here where somebody was in the process of eating something. So you take all that into context, and you sit down and you think about what it is that normal dinners and things are eaten between the hours of 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock in the evening. And all that adds up and is being consistent with the murders occurring between those hours that we talked about, between 6:53 and 8:21. So now they've established when they believe the murders occurred. They've established communication and what Brandy's doing. They've gone out and they've done this. And they start looking towards how are we going to apply this. And of course, as we talked about during jury selection, motive. Who had a reason to do this? You're going to hear investigators talk about their training. So as it relates to the motive, one of the things they know through their training and experience is that many, many times these things come down to a couple of different situations. Either motive, love, relationship, money, in some way, shape, or form is usually connected to these. So they start looking for what that motive would be. What they're also going to look for is means. Who's got the ability to carry out something like this? One of the things you're going to hear from Dr. Flanagan is one of the wounds in the forehead area on Brandy Peters was she was hit so hard it actually crushed the skull. And she was hit repeatedly over and over and over. But because of that hit on your skull, somebody who did this had to have a lot of strength. Had to be really, really strong. The other thing you're going to hear from is Florida Department of Law Enforcement, Jeff Foggy. Jeff Foggy is now an agent. Back then he was a firearm analyst for many years. You heard that we actually recovered projectiles, which are the spent bullets, from the scene. We found one in the bathroom, or actually two in the bathroom, one in the hallway closet. Also, during the autopsy, other projectiles were removed actually from Ms. Peters. She was shot multiple times as well as beaten. The gunshot injuries were not the cause of the death, however. However, they were the cause of death. What you're going to hear is that so they start looking for these questions. And of course, the other thing they do is they look for who had the opportunity to do that. Who had access to the house? Who was there? Remember, there wasn't a forced entry at this home. So who would have been let in? Someone they knew? As I said, you were going to hear from Foggy, Jeff Foggy, that the gun that was utilized in the projectiles were 32 caliber. Now, the interesting thing about 32 caliber is apparently there are two different kinds of bullets that can be used in a 32 caliber pistol. And it's a pistol round, it's not a rifle round. And if you use the wrong one, it actually doesn't work like it's supposed to. What happens is, and he can explain this a lot better, but essentially what happens is the bullet doesn't get the velocity and the energy that is usually you think of when it comes to firearms. And as a result, it doesn't have the power that it's supposed to. And what you're going to hear is with Brandy's injury, that she was actually shot one time in the head and it never pierced her skull. And as I said, none of those injuries, or the gunshots, were the cause of her death because they didn't do enough damage. you're actually going to see photographs from the scene that show where a bullet basically bounced off one of those thin rails that are on shower stalls. It hit it, made a small dent, and bounced down to the ground. You're going to see another one where it hit a porcelain toilet and bounced onto the ground. So these were, even though they were gunshots, they didn't have any power behind them for whatever reason. So one of the things law enforcement officers do, of course, they've established that these are the kind of things they need to know in order to figure out where this investigation is going to go. Now what you're going to hear is that one of the first things they do is they're actually notifying Henry Segura of the death of his son. They know that Javante Segura is Henry Segura's son. They haven't heard from him. So law enforcement officers have to notify somebody. Tell them. Your son passed away. And you're going to hear, of course, that law enforcement officers, when they do interviews, and this would apply no matter whether the person's a suspect, just a person that's a witness, or whatnot. And at the time, Mr. Segura was not a suspect in any way, shape, or form. This is for the purposes of letting him know about his child. This is for the purposes of going back and talking to family members, known acquaintances, getting that information they need from Brandy to figure out who might have done this, to figure out who Brandy Peters was. That was the purpose behind this. So they're asking them questions. But of course, law enforcement are trained. They look for verbal and nonverbal cues. Not only what they say, but how they say it. Their posturing, things along those lines that might give an indication about whether the person's truthful or not. They look for whether the person has emotions or lack of emotions when they're telling certain information. They look, of course, to whether they're being deceived. And ultimately, they apply their investigative tools, the education they receive, their common sense, and those tools that they utilize day in and day out. And you're going to have an opportunity to see this initial this interview. And what you're going to see is that Mr. Segura has a lack of emotions when he's told about his child. And not Mr. Segura says, I was at home on the 19th during the time period. Just check my phone records. It'll tell you I'm home. Here's my phone number. 509-8380. Says that the next day, he went down to Silas Thornton's house. Silas Thornton lives in Sopchoppy area. And the next morning, on the 20th, he went down to Mr. Thornton's house. So law enforcement officers, of course, want to talk to Mr. Thornton. So they ask for the phone number. And this actually is not on the interview. What happens here is that Mr. Segura tells law enforcement, so I don't have it on me, so investigator Lewis goes out to Mr. Segura's car, and at that point, Mr. Segura says, Mr. Thornton's phone number is 850-408-8669. He says, whoa, wait a minute, that's not it. And he gives another number. Officer Lewis takes them both down. Doesn't think any more of it. Next day, they go out. And talk to Silas Thornton. Silas Thornton says, yeah, I know Henry Segura. I don't know Brandy Peters. That's not my phone. You're going to hear that there's a CID meeting. And during this meeting, Chris Corbett's there along with the investigative team. And he's letting him know about this cell phone information. And he says, whoa, that number, we need to find out who it is that owns that 408-8669. Because that number was in contact with Brandy Peters all day on the day of the homicide. Multiple times throughout the course of the day. Investigator Lewis has recognized this. So wait, that's the one that belongs to Silas Thornton. We'll talk to Silas Thornton. Again, He says, I know Henry Segura, I work with him. They're both welders. So that 408-8669 number used to be his, but he was with Segura working with him and actually dropped it in some water and got some water damage. And during that time period, Mr. Segura says, dude, put it in a bag, put some rice in there to absorb the water out of it and maybe it'll work again. That's what he does. However, he left it in Segura's truck, got a new phone, and moved on. But he does know that Mr. Segura uses that phone at that point. So now we have two phone numbers. We know the importance of this one because it is the one that Randy Peters is talking about all day long in the day of the homicide. And this is the one that Mr. Segura tells us about. So you're going to hear at this particular time, but we really don't know who owns this phone. Mr. Segura says it's Silas Thornton. Mr. Thornton says it's Henry Segura. So now we're going to go back to the phone record. And this is where Investigator Corbett comes back in. Investigator Corbett says he goes back and he analyzes these particular records. And what he has found is that at 8:30 in the morning, that we're talking about November the 19th, the day the state of search is the time of the homicide, that there's a phone call between Randy Peters' phone and that 408-8669. Investigator Corbett is going to tell you that one of the things these records will let you know about is star 67 was used to make that phone call. What star 67 is a block. It doesn't tell you, caller ID, who it is that actually that phone belongs to. So this is a phone call that's being sent out from that number, but it's blocked so it won't show up on this Peters phone. What you're going to hear is that phone call lasted for 56 minutes. Fair to say that 56-minute phone call, probably someone she knows. What Investigator Corbett's also going to tell you is between 1:18 and 1:28 on that same day, there's a series of calls, all of which star 67 is utilized. I'll tell you again, at 2:13 p.m. there's another phone call lasting for 2 minutes and 35 seconds from that same phone number. Again, star 67 is used. Now, at 2:19 p.m., Ms. Peters sends a text message to 509-83-4380. That's the one and the phone number that Henry Segura gave to law enforcement as his phone number. And in that, she said, "You hang up on me?" (2:13, 2:19). What does that tell you about who she was talking to on the phone? If she's returning the text message to Henry Segura's phone, she talked to Mr. Segura. What you're going to hear then, at the 2:27 p.m., the 408-8669 returns the phone call to Ms. Peters' phone, again, using the star 67 function. Again, this is the phone number that Mr. Segura gave, said it was Silas Thornton's phone. Never told law enforcement it was mine. Law enforcement officers dig a little bit deeper. They talked to Calvin Moore. Calvin Moore says, yeah, I know he had a 408 number. They talked to Tyrell Coxon. Says, yeah, I know he had a 408 number. So friends of Mr. Segura are confirming that they've actually talked to Mr. Segura on that 408 number. So now we've actually confirmed that that 850 408-8669. Through the testimony, you're going to hear it, through the testimony of Tyler Coxon, Calvin Moore, as well as a cell phone record, that this is in fact a phone that Mr. Segura utilizes. So we go back to our tools that is being utilized by Investigator Lewis. One of the things is emotions or lack of emotion. And the biggest one is, of course, deception. So now, Henry Segura has become a suspect. Based upon that. We know he deceived. We know he didn't have any motive. So now the question becomes, let's go back and apply what it is that we've learned as an investigator. And Investigator Mark Lewis goes back and they start directing, here he directs it to figure out, was there any motive? And again, we go back to what motive is. What they find out through a search of records, and Vance Wiggins from the Florida Department of Revenue is going to come in and testify. And you're going to hear from Mr. Wiggins that the records at the Florida Department of Revenue show that Henry Segura was ordered to pay child support on Javante Segura and was actually behind on the child support by a pretty large amount of money. As we've already seen, money many times is the motive in a murder. But that's not all. That doesn't necessarily mean, of course, that he killed his son. But it's there. The next thing is they ask means. Investigator Lewis has an opportunity to observe Mr. Segura. They've done the investigation. You're going to hear from him as observations. And of course, you're going to see him during the course of the interview. Of course, you can see him in court. Means, strength, murder weapon. Testimony is going to tell you from Silas Thornton. He's a welder, big, strong guy. You're going to see it. So he has the strength to carry this out. We talked about that injury. Then Ms. Flanagan is, or Dr. Flanagan is going to testify to it. This is a gun. You're going to hear from Calvin Moore. Calvin Moore is a longtime friend of Mr. Segura. Calvin Moore has known him for years and years and years, back through high school, even before then. Calvin Moore was in the United States Army, I believe it was. He knows about firearms. And he's going to tell you, I saw Henry Segura with a .32 caliber pistol before this. You're also going to hear from Tyrell Coxon. Tyrell Coxon is a former girlfriend of Mr. Segura. And what you're going to hear is that following these homicides, there was an anonymous tip made to the Crime Stopping Network and said that just before the homicide, Mr. Segura had told this anonymous person that wanted to get a throwdown gun. Law enforcement officers, in doing their investigation, their background information, are now going out and talking to people that they know have talked to Mr. Segura on that 408 number. One of those persons is Tyra Wilcoxon. So they go to Ms. Wilcoxon's home and they start asking her questions, and she says, "Oh, you're here about that anonymous tip." Law enforcement officer had no idea she was the one that made the phone call. Turns out she wasn't. What Ms. Wilcoxon is going to tell you is that just before these homicides, Mr. Segura approached her and asked her for that throwdown gun. Also, she's going to tell you that she had regular communications with him on that 408 number. So now we add that up. Got a gun that's consistent with the crime scene. Got a strength. Does that add up to means? So next the question becomes, did he have the opportunity? Was he there? Did he have access? He obviously would have access to the home. Devontae Segura is his son. In fact, you're going to hear he was actually at the home a couple days before, on the 17th, the Wednesday before. So was he there at the time? Go back to the cell phone records. And you're going to hear Investigator Corbett does a comparison. He's going to come in and he's going to talk about this. And he's going to compare the data between Randy Peters' phone and Mr. Segura's phone. That 408 number, the one he didn't tell law enforcement about. And he makes a comparison, and he finds out that both of the phones are inactive between 6:53 and 7:23. At that point, Randy's phone remains inactive, and Mr. Segura has two data sessions, at 7:23 and 7:37. And then both of the phones again are inactive from 7:37 to 8:21. And we already talked about at 8:21, Randy's phone is powered down. Also, at 8:21, Mr. Segura made a 2-second call with an immediate disconnect. Both of them at the exact same time. Now, cell phone data doesn't always just tell you what calls were made, what texts were sent. It doesn't always tell you what the contents were. It can also tell you what they call RTT data. And you can hear from Investigator Corbett, and he can explain this a lot better than I can. But what essentially RTT data is each cell phone communicates with a cell phone tower. And each one of those towers have 3 different sectors. And each one of those sectors covers roughly 33% of the circle. Okay? What also happens is, in order for our phones to communicate, Investigator Corbett's going to tell you that these phones send out a signal. The phone receives a signal and sends it back. And these cell phone companies do a calculation that's essentially a time distance calculation. They know what speed these things are going out. They can do a calculation to tell you the distance essentially that the phone would be from that cell tower. They tell you which tower it was communicating as well as what sector of the tower it was communicating. And what Investigator Corbett's going to tell you is that he took this data and essentially he gets the information about how far the cell phone was from a particular tower. And he'll do a plot and he'll figure out things. And what he'll tell you is the first thing he did is he went and looked at that 850-509-4380. This is the phone number that Henry Segura gave law enforcement officers during the interview and said, this is my phone. This is the phone number that he said, check the phone records. How about my house? And Investigator Corbett's going to tell you that when he analyzes that RTT data, that phone number is consistent, that data is consistent that that phone would be at Mr. Segura's house. Exactly where it said it would be. But he's also going to tell you it was inactive. It was only receiving. Nothing was being sent from that phone. We know the phone was at his house, or consistent with being at his house. But nobody was utilizing that particular phone. So now, we go back and we look at his 408-8669 number, which is the phone we now know to be Segura's. And you know that because you heard it from, at this point, you would have heard it from Mr. Coxon, she's had conversations with him there. Mr. Moore, because he's had conversations with him. Silas Thornton has told you that it's his phone number, as well as you take into account the context that Investigator Corbett has already testified to, and that exchange of phone calls and text messages that we already talked about between the two phones. And when you chart that arc and that distance arc, Investigator Corbett does this. Finds out that at 8:47 in this sector is where the phone is communicating with. That the sector, it really isn't a hard line, it's more of a, they can go kind of either way at certain points, and it kind of falls right along where Brandy Peters' house is. And when you do the arc calculations about where it was, I'm pretty close to it. But at that point, law enforcement then go and they talk to Silas Thornton. And they go with Silas Thornton to Walmart. And they purchase a phone. Silas Thornton says, that's the phone that we're talking about. That's the kind of phone we're talking about. The cell phone data also tells what kind of phone, the type of phone that is being utilized. So Investigator Corbett also utilizes that to make sure we're doing the same phone. And they purchased the phone from Walmart. Same phone, same make, same model. And they conduct their own test. They go out, they make phone calls, they make text messages, they make data. They stand, they go to different locations. They go to Brandy Peters' house. They stand in her living room. They stand outside the home. They go to a whole bunch of different locations, and they're going to tell you about, including Mrs. Segura's home. Bunch of different places, almost 100 of them. In order to come to that way, they can compare the data between the two phones. And they get the cell phone data as to this new TPD phone, if you will. It's the one that they purchased. It's identical to the one that's connected to the 408 number. And they chart those same arcs. And when you put them side by side, they're nearly identical. Now what you're going to hear is all of this took a long time. This isn't something, as we talked about CSI, it's not overnight. In fact, it took almost a full year to get to this point. And you're going to hear at this point, Henry Segura is no longer a suspect. Henry Segura is being arrested for this charge. And you're going to hear that Henry Segura was actually arrested up in Minnesota. You're going to hear that he was misspelled Minnesota. And you're going to hear that he was transported to Oklahoma on his way to Florida. This is actually transported by different entities. But he's taken to Oklahoma, and he's there at Oklahoma, in which he has a cellmate named Kelsey Kennard. This immediate after his arrest, we're talking 2011, almost 1 year after that. And you're going to have an opportunity to hear from Kelsey Kennard. And what Mr. Kennard is going to tell you that Henry Segura said he did this. A lot more information he's going to tell you. He's going to talk about all the things that Mr. Segura said, including the fact that they were 2 kids, or multiple kids. Now we look at it, and again, Investigator Lewis applies the motive, what he's learned. He applies the motive, the means, the opportunity to add in the confession. And that's why the state is going to ask you to return a verdict of guilty as it relates to Henry Segura versus State Court.
Well, let's take 15 minutes, we'll let the jury step out. Okay? Just leave your notes where they are.
Nope, can't do that. Why not? You can't get the backs of the people.
Either side,
Not at all.
No.
Why not? Because like,
We'll stay
you
inside.
can't get their image or likeness. I've been recording like for 2 to 3 millions and then said you can't tell. Mike, I'm sorry, but I'm just on the risk. What if I can find them around? Not that.
All right, let's come back to session. Either sit down or step out, please, folks. Mr. Brent.
There are concern before we move, I can figure that first now rather than wait until the end of the defense. Opening statement, I resume before we go into the state's case about photographic evidence, they may tend to try to put in front of the jury as well as testimony that it seems Mr. Fuchs was intent on eliciting from Mark Lewis to deal with them in turn. First, with respect to crime scene photos and the walkthrough video of the scene, which actually shows the children being taken out of the frame. The crime scene photos are horrific. The blood spatter photos are going to be, of course, relevant for reconstruction of the scene, and some of the autopsy pictures may be relevant for reconstruction of the scene. But showing, in particular, the children in the bathtub is highly prejudicial. I wasn't shown a copy of the PowerPoint presentation before we started. Highly prejudicial to the defense. Clearly motivated by nothing other than to inflame the jury's passions, make them disgusted. While I recognize that the state has a right to put on their case, they don't have a right to induce evidence, which is more prejudicial than probative, and those pictures simply are not probative of anything. That's the first issue. The second issue with regard to testimony, it seems Mr. Fuchs didn't seem his intent to elicit from Investigator Lewis. I would object and move the court to prevent any testimony regarding training or experience in detecting deceptiveness or an opinion regarding lack of emotion. Certainly with respect to emotion, he can testify as to what he saw, what he observed, but to characterize it or make conclusory statements about it is improper. And it's clearly improper for him to testify essentially as a human lie detector. Based on his training and experience, Mr. Segura was being evasive or untruthful. I think that testimony would be inappropriate and is not proper at all.
What exactly, in terms of Lewis, what exactly are you asking me to rule that he can't do?
I would ask that you rule he not be allowed to make any conclusory statements about Mr. Segura's emotions or emotional state. Again, it's fine for him to say what he observed, but to say there's a lack of emotion, that he was cold, or that he was emotionless, I think those conclusions are inappropriate. Then with respect to, based on, I'm trained to detect indicators of deception, he was being deceptive. I mean, certainly he can talk about lies that Mr. Segura told, saying that, he wasn't home, or that he was home at the time, and then ultimately they discovered evidence indicating he wasn't. But as far as detecting deception within the context of an interview in real time, I think that testimony is inappropriate.
I mean, I don't disagree with what you've said, but I think these are things we just have to deal with during the course of the testimony. I don't think they're so inherently prejudicial that we can't deal with it on a question-by-question basis. Obviously, the state can't imply that their investigator is a human lie detector. I think they understand that. But I think we have to deal with it on a question-by-question basis. And I think on the photos, we're going to have to deal with it in the same way. When do you think you're going to get into the photos, Mr. Fuchs?
There's actually two, there's a limited number of photographs with Investigator Wyman, who is going to be, Officer Wyman, who is fourth in line, I believe it is, fifth in line. So he's relatively early. There is a series of photos there. They do include the photo that was utilized in the PowerPoint presentation. Investigator Bravo will follow him up, and that is the crime scene video. That's not the one that Mr. Prince is referring to. The crime scene photo or video that's being shown is the initial one as they went into the home. And if you need to, it's 12 minutes, and we can show to the court to view that. But it's a walkthrough of the house as they first started, and it's not the removal of the bodies at that point.
Well, I doubt we're going to get to any of that before lunch. If you show Mr. Prince what you intend to get into today, and over our lunch break we can argue about the specifics of that. I'm not going to have the jury sitting around waiting on us. We can cut into our lunch break and we'll argue about that at lunchtime.
Yes, sir.
All right, we'll be in recess.
Your Honor, if I can, before we go to recess, I would ask that we mark, I printed out the PowerPoint for the record purposes, and we can mark this as state's demonstrative 1, so that way it's in the record for review.
Any objections, Mr. Prince?
No, Your Honor.
All right. Ready for me? Everybody be seated. Good to see you, Mr. Prince.
The crimes are absolutely unspeakable. Horrific. I have seen some of the worst autopsy photos and crime scene photos you can imagine. None of those hit you in your soul like the pictures you will see in this case, like the testimony you will hear in this case. What I'm going to ask you to do is what you said you would do in jury selection, which is respect the presumption of innocence. And I don't mean just sit there and wait for the state to prove the case. I'm going to do something to help you. Of course, right? Of course. I'll show you DNA because I have DNA. I'll show you forensic evidence because we have forensic evidence. I'll show you step by step by step where Mr. Segura was throughout the day, and I won't ask you to draw any conclusions. They're not totally supported by the evidence that you hear. This case is a terrible tragedy. But tragedy is compounded where more innocent people suffer. And so to prevent that, let me just ask you from the outset to remember your oaths and remember the instructions regarding presumption of innocence that the judge gave you. I have a lot of evidence that I'm going to present to you during the course of the trial. All different kinds. I just mentioned some. As I sat there last night pondering what the heart of the defense is in this case, it isn't the forensics. It's not the DNA. It's the heart of the man sitting at the table with the defense team. My oath to you is that I will not ask you to step over bodies on the way to a not guilty verdict without showing you, with evidence, a window to that soul. That isn't fair to you. I know, burden of proof, it's their burden, solely and exclusively. I know. 3 dead babies. I know that too. We're all people in this courtroom. I know that too. So while I, at one instance, ask you to follow the law, I'm not going to just hang it on you and say, oh, follow the law, ignore the facts. I will show you who he is. You'll know who he is, as I know who he is by the end of this trial. But of course, the forensic evidence and DNA and all that kind of stuff is important too. So let me tell you about the conclusions that both the defense DNA expert and the state's DNA expert drew upon review of the DNA evidence in this case. Over 200 DNA samples were collected from around the murder scene in this case, from places relevant to the investigation, relevant to the murders. Henry Segura was not included as a contributor to a single evidentiary exhibit. In fact, he was excluded, meaning eliminated as a possible contributor for most of them. Consensus from Joe Ellen Brown, the FDLE analyst who did the initial work on this case, did it blind without having any idea who the suspect was, what the state's theory of prosecution would be, who the suspects were for the investigating agency. Those were her determinations. The defense expert, years down the road, came in, looked at the same electropherograms, which are charts that you'll see during the course of the trial that are essentially the paper printout of what a DNA profile looks like. She reviewed those, the defense DNA expert reviewed those, and drew the same conclusions. Henry Segura is not included in anything. Henry Segura is excluded from virtually all of the DNA samples collected. But that's not all. Other people were found to have contributed DNA. People outside the victim's family. People outside the victim's group of friends. Angel Antonio Avila Quinones. The phone that was ripped out of the wall. Phone cord ripped in half. His DNA was found on that phone cord, on that phone cradle. The defense DNA expert looked at the evidentiary sample, looked at the DNA chart, the electropherogram, for the swab of that phone. He compared it to the DNA profile for Mr. Avila. He was able to do what they call inclusion statistics. Rather than saying, it's a 99.9% match, that's not what DNA experts say. They do it in terms of rate of inclusion or frequency of occurrence. What frequency of occurrence means is you would expect to see this particular DNA profile occur this many times within a given population. In this case, the rate of occurrence, or frequency of occurrence, was 1 in every 15,000 Latins. Mr. Avila is Latin. It occurs one time in every 15,000 Latins. One person would be included. That means, he'll tell you, the opposite, 14,999 people out of 15,000 would be excluded, eliminated as possible contributors, and could not have contributed to that DNA because they don't have those DNA numbers at those DNA markers. Math is simple. 99.95% of the population of the Latin people on this planet are eliminated from being a possible contributor to that DNA mixture. But Angel Antonio Avila Quinones was included. He wasn't the only person who they found evidence relating to, though. It was obvious, and you'll see pictures of this, it was obvious Brandy Peters fought heroically for her children's lives. It's true. It's true that she was beaten to death with multiple different objects and suffered horrible wounds. But she continued to fight until the life left her body. Her fingers are broken. Her acrylic nails ripped from her hand. Her knuckles bruised and cut and swollen. There was DNA under her fingernails. Under Brandy's right index fingernail, foreign female DNA, I always say foreign, that means not her DNA, was found. Not her daughter's, not anybody else around the house who she's friends with or family with. Under her right pinky fingernail, foreign female DNA. Under her left index fingernail, foreign female DNA. Under her left middle fingernail, foreign female DNA. There was also a shovel located right next to Brandy's body in the foyer. Upon the shovel, Joe Ellen Brown discovered foreign male DNA. Henry Segura is excluded as a possible contributor to the foreign male DNA on the shovel found right next to her body. The crime scene forensics also proved definitively that multiple people were involved in the commission of the offense. There were 4 separate sets of footprints in the blood in this case. Footprints that did not belong to the victims and did not belong to law enforcement. Victim Peters suffered wounds from multiple different types of objects, sharp and blunt. At least 2, plus the gun. The forensic evidence further proves that one of the victims, Tanaya, was held up by one person and shot by another. The way that we know that is that, number one, there's no saturation of her blood on the floor, meaning once she was shot, her body never hit the ground. Secondly, there's something called stippling on the back of her head. What that means is that the gun that shoots her has to be within roughly 3 feet of her head at the time she's shot. What we don't see, however, is soot deposit, which means that the gun has to be at least a foot away from her head. So if it was one person, he'd have to be holding her like this with the gun way back here and then hold her up after she's shot. Suppose someone could make that argument, but you won't hear me make that argument. In addition to that, we have, as I mentioned before, foreign DNA at different locations on different objects from different people. Again, consistent with the notion that multiple people were involved in the commission of the offense. And then we have the type of evidence that we talked about in jury selection, circumstantial evidence. One of the types of circumstantial evidence you'll be asked to consider here is evidence pertaining to motive. There are a few things you should know about the motive the state's asserting here. It's true Mr. Segura did have a back child support judgment against him. He was going to be asked to pay $700 and some odd a month. It's also true that he was a little bit behind at the time. He was a little strapped for cash. He'd been injured and wasn't able to work like he normally did. But it didn't take him that long to get back on his feet. By the time he was arrested up in Minnesota, he was on a job where he was making $10,000 a month. Now, I'll tell you, Mr. Segura doesn't report all of his income. Sometimes he gets paid partially under the table. Sometimes he gets paid totally under the table. But he had no shortage of cash under normal circumstances. His wife, Malika, or now ex-wife, Malika, will tell you Henry would routinely spend $700, $800, $900, $1,000 a month fixing up the old cars that he worked on at his house. Another thing that you'll be asked to consider, and you'll hear evidence about pertaining to his child support debt, is that he actually helped facilitate institution of that child support debt. He went twice on 2 separate occasions, because they lost paperwork once, to the DFS office on North Monroe Street and provided paperwork to help push that process along, move it along, so that he didn't have to keep having the victim ask him for cash as opposed to just paying through DFS. Another thing that you'll hear testimony about is that Mr. Segura had been through the child support process before and knew exactly how to deal with it. One of his child's mothers, and he does have children out of wedlock, Tamika Steele Hawkins, or Clark, I guess she's now married, Clark, will testify on his behalf at this trial. She went further than victim Peters had ever gotten with her child support dispute with the defendant. She actually had him at one point, several years ago, many years ago now, thrown in jail. But he got out, he went to court, he got the child support judgment reduced because, as in this case, Ms. Hawkins waited until her child was a few years old to go have paternity established. And when that happens, a large back child support judgment hits. Mr. Segura went to court, he explained to the judge he'd been buying items and providing cash all throughout the child's life at different intervals. And the judge reduced the judgment, and he never got put back in jail after that. He knew how to do it. That's all he had to do in this case, and that's what he would have done in this case, because he had been making cash payments at irregular intervals during Javante's lifetime. He simply didn't have time to do that before he was killed. The other thing that you'll hear testimony about and be asked to consider in the context of thinking about the motive the state has put before you is that it wasn't just Brandy that was killed. Javante is Mr. Segura's son. The 2 little girls that were killed lived with him. He and Brandy, during a time when Malika Segura and Henry Segura were going through a rough patch, Brandy was one of Mr. Segura's girlfriends, and he lived with her for a while. Those little girls called him Daddy. He took them to school. He helped potty train. Ask yourself, in the context of motive consideration, as you hear the evidence, whether slaughtering those 3 children could possibly have anything to do with child support. Another important piece of circumstantial evidence relates to the time of death. You've seen the cell phone data. We don't dispute the cell phone data. Henry is at Brandy's house between 5-ish, a little after that maybe, and 8 o'clock. He lied about that. I'll explain that to you in a little while. He was there at her house between 5 and 8 o'clock. But she wasn't dead during that time. And there's a lot of circumstantial evidence which can be introduced to prove that. Number 1, there's a witness named Marquise Davis who lived with one of the witness the state told you about, C.C. Timmons. Marquise Davis, on the day of the murder, saw someone else's vehicle in Brandy's driveway at 8:30 p.m., right after Henry had left. In fact, that's the reason Henry left, because somebody else was coming over. Marquise Davis will tell you he knows for certain what Henry's truck looks like. Henry has a very distinctive truck. It has big fat back tires, it has sparkly green paint, and it has a spoiler on the back. That truck in her driveway was not his truck. Another piece of important evidence. You heard the state talk about the digested food in the victim's stomach. Marquise Davis fed the victims their last meal at 7 o'clock p.m. the day of the murder. They don't know that because they've never spoken to him. Marquise Davis was making oxtail stew on the day of the murder. He'd been cooking it for some hours. At 6:53, C.C. Timmons texted Brandy and asked her if she wanted some. The girls were over playing at their house at that time, at C.C. and Marquise Davis's house. Brandy said she didn't want any. So he fed the girls some of the stew. They ate it and shortly thereafter went home. Another piece of evidence, which tends to indicate the murders happened much later, is that Brandy's sister, Monica Peters, told police the day the bodies were discovered on the scene that she last spoke to Brandy at 10 o'clock p.m. Why is that significant? Because both sides agree. Henry Segura is home by 9:31 p.m. on the night of the murder and never leaves again. Both phones, his girlfriend phone and his primary phone, are home and active for the rest of the night. Monica Peters says she talked to her at 10 o'clock p.m. Another piece of circumstantial evidence is that someone did hear something. Just not the type of someone you might have thought. These houses are really close together. And the evidence is going to show they're not, by any stretch of the imagination, quiet houses. In fact, if you stand in front of Brandy Peters' house, you can hear the toilet flush in either one of her next door neighbor's house. At 12:30 p.m., the dog at the house right next door to Brandy Peters started going absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. To the point where neighbors, probably 100 yards away, called the police. The police actually came out and did a report. Welfare drive through the neighborhood, didn't see anything. That fact is significant because you'll hear forensic evidence which shows at some point during the altercation, Brandy Peters made it out of the house. There are blood transfer marks going from inside her house to outside her house, through the front door. There's blood spatter on the vinyl siding outside of the house, meaning she gets out the door, somebody hits her from behind. She made it all the way to the grass. We know that because she's got a grass stain on the bottom of her sock before she's grabbed and taken back inside. That evidence is consistent with the dog going crazy, to the point where neighbors have to call the police. Another piece of important circumstantial evidence has to do with the cleanup scene. Jack McLean Park. At least one of the people involved in the commission of the offense probably cleaned up at Jack McLean Park. How do we know that? Within 5 days of the offense, law enforcement discovered clothes that had been covered in blood, the assailant's blood, apparently. They discovered shop towels, they discovered bleach, They found a bunch of pairs of latex gloves. They found blood drops on the sink at the bathroom at the park. There's a couple interesting pieces of information about the clothing that they found there. Number one, the shirt, there's a dress shirt and a t-shirt. The dress shirt has some puncture damage through one of the sleeves. And from that puncture area, blood covers the shirt. That blood was tested. It excludes the victims. Henry Segura has not been included as a contributor to that blood. Additionally, new clothing tags were found at the scene. Pants tags, shoe tags. The pant size was 44 waist. Mr. Segura was size 36 at the time. You'll hear from his wife. You'll see pants from his dad that had been at his dad's house since he was arrested. Mr. Segura is also a size 11, not a size 12. Another thing that you can glean from the evidence found at Jack McLean Park with respect to the damage to the shirt and the blood on the shirt, especially when you combine it with the state of Brandy's hands, is that the person or people who were engaged in battle with Brandy would have been messed up. Mr. Segura is a light-skinned African-American man. Light-skinned African-American people tend to show bruises, tend to show scratches. He was photographed by TPD the day after the incident without a mark on it. Now, he did have one tiny little scratch on his forearm, nowhere near the injury point on the sleeve. Tiny little scratch, couldn't have produced blood. That tiny little scratch was from shooting bows and arrows and retrieving arrows out of a rose bush earlier that day. Not at all consistent with the type of injuries someone engaged in this violent conflict would have shown. One of the other pieces of circumstantial evidence you'll be asked to look at is the lack of evidence that ties Mr. Segura to this offense. There is no DNA. There are no witnesses that tie him to the offense. There's no physical evidence of any kind which ties him to the offense. You'll hear from the medical examiner, crime scene reconstructionist, that there was blood spatter everywhere. The people who committed this offense would have been covered in the victim's blood. None of the victim's blood is in his car or his truck. None of the victim's blood is found on clothing anywhere near him. You'll also hear that following the murders, Tallahassee Police Department not only got all his communications from both his girlfriend phone and his normal cell phone, they wiretapped or put listening devices in his truck and followed him with GPS. Over the course of months, not a single communication ever with any co-conspirators. No communications on either cell phone with any co-conspirators. And then we have the fact that an opportunity was missed to get at least some of the assailants on HD video buying their cleanup clothes. At the scene at Jack McLean Park is a UPC tag. You will hear that law enforcement can routinely, in the course of an investigation, if it's during the time frame where the store still has their video, and it was only 5 days, they can take a UPC code to Walmart. This was a Walmart tag, it said Walmart on it, the UPC code was fully intact, and get the video of the purchase where that item was bought. They just bagged it, took it to TPD, never bothered to get the video. You're also going to hear that during the course of the investigation, credible evidence was discovered linking a particular person to the offense, somebody other than Mr. Segura. Detective Basio claimed initially that that was nothing. It turned out to be nothing. They got the DNA, they talked to his alibi witnesses, got the cell phone. What actually happened was they got the DNA, they got his DNA, never sent it to TPD, or to FDLE for testing, never compared it to any of the evidentiary exhibits found in this case. They never went and interviewed any of his alibi witnesses. They never bothered to get his phone records. They did get his associate's phone records, and those phone records showed his associate in the area of Brandy Peters' house all night. When asked about that, why he didn't get that information regarding this particular suspect, Detective Basio said, well, he just had a gut feeling the guy was telling the truth. The last piece of circumstantial evidence you'll get to see is not overwhelming. It's just a glimpse. It's just a glimpse into how Mr. Segura was feeling and dealing with this. Witnesses will tell you, after the deaths, on his dashboard in his truck, he constantly kept Javante's obituary. I submit that's inconsistent with the state's theory. So why are we here? You heard some of the evidence. There's obviously some evidence which made it look bad initially. Let's start with why he lied about being there. Henry Segura is one of the most unfaithful people you will ever hear about. He always had been. He has children out of wedlock, cheated on his wife basically their entire relationship. He had a son pass away about 1.5 years before this incident from natural causes. He was born prematurely. At that point, he made a promise to his wife that he was done with that. He would not cheat anymore. He broke that promise. Repeatedly. He lied about one thing over and over and over in his multiple interviews with the police. Not one of those lies was specific to Brandy Peters. They asked him, do you cheat on your wife? Not since our son died. Do you cheat with Natasha Hawthorne? Absolutely not. We're just friends. You cheat with this person. You cheat with that person. No, no, no. You're going to see his text messages. He's texting random women. Sex, question mark? He's having conversation with Natasha Hawthorne constantly about hooking up. What happened with Brandy Peters is that sort of a chance encounter led them to hook up again. It had been quite a while since Mr. Segura and Brandy Peters had been together, but this was how that sequence went. On Tuesday, Brandy Peters was mad at Henry. She texted him basically saying, I'm going to have you put in jail for not paying child support. Wednesday, Henry goes over to her house and kind of smooths it over. Look, I've been injured. I haven't been able to work. You know I make money. Let me get on top of it. We'll take care of it. Everything was fine after that. How do we know it was fine after that? Because on Thursday, Brandy Peters texts Henry and says, man, you look good yesterday. If you weren't my baby daddy, I would have hooked up with you. Henry, ever the opportunist, immediately starts calling back with her. That's why they're calling all day Thursday and Friday. They're planning their hookup. The call at 2:15 or so, Brandy's basically telling them we're going to pick up the girls from school, we're going to be back soon. It took a little longer, however, than what they had planned to actually get to do it because Brandy's mom was with them. Brandy ended up going to get a snack at Burger King. She brought it back. Finally, Brandy's mom left at about 5 o'clock. That's when Henry came over. They did have sex. He left at some point later after they had sex. He was there while she was on the phone with her mom. He was there when she was making herself some food to eat. He was talking with Javante. He spent a little time with him. And then he left. And then we know someone else was there. I know when you hear the information about the Star 67 calls, that sounds nefarious. There was nothing nefarious about that. What you'll hear is that the only reason he was Star 67ing Brandy is because she psycho calls. And he doesn't want her psycho calling him when he's with one of his other girlfriends. That's what he uses that Star 67 for, to prevent her from getting his girlfriend phone number. If she's going to call him, he wants it to be on his primary phone. We've got those text messages to show you. You'll see the communications that were taking place between Brandy and Henry. She knew that was his phone. And the other part of it is, he doesn't think anybody's ever going to find his girlfriend phone. That's what he's trying to hide. He has no reason to block the phone number to prevent it from being on phone records. It shows up on phone records anyway. Just because you start Star 67 doesn't mean the number isn't going to show up on the phone records. That's not what he was trying to do. He was trying to prevent her from calling him constantly. The other reason that we're here is because of Tyra Wilcoxon. Tyra Wilcoxon says Henry came to her the week of the murder. He was all mad. He wanted a gun. That's not what the evidence is going to be. Tyra Wilcoxon and Henry had a messy breakup. He left her on the side of the road in Savannah, Georgia after a fight. She called his wife Malika and told her that she was on the road with Henry and they had been having an affair. And she saw an opportunity to make money. There was a $25,000 Crime Stoppers reward. This guy is her ex-boyfriend. And so she goes and tells TPD, he came to my house asking for a gun. The cell phone records will prove Henry Segura was nowhere near Tyra Wilcoxon's house during the week of the murder, as she claims. And then you have Kelsey Kennard, last but not least. His testimony is not consistent with the other evidence, not consistent with the facts, and not consistent with logic. And you'll be given an instruction by the judge that tells you to use extreme caution when evaluating the testimony of snitch witnesses. There's a reason we're here, right? There's a reason we're here. There was some evidence which made it look like initially Henry Segura was involved in or committed this murder. But that's not the best evidence. The best evidence will be introduced by the defense. I will show you who he is before the end of this trial. Thank you.
I think it's a little bit early, but I think we're going to take a lunch break at this point because I have a legal issue I need to resolve with the attorneys, and we don't need you sitting in the jury room while we do that. So let's go ahead and take our lunch break at this point in time. Let's be back at 12:30. I'll give you an hour and 10 minutes. We ought to be able to get our legal issue resolved and have enough time for a little lunch. You've explained to them where you want them to meet. Yep. Just leave your notes where you are. Have a nice lunch. Everybody be seated. Is Mr. Timmons going to be your next witness, Mr. Keith?
Give him the lunch break, yes, sir. Actually, it's going to be Mrs. Timmons.
What's that?
It's going to be Mrs. Timmons.
Anyway, one or the other of them. It was going to be a little difficult to get them here quickly,
Yes,
so that's why I wanted to go ahead and take the lunch break. All right, we wanted to be heard. Y'all were going to work out which photos we're talking about?
I don't know how relevant Mr. Fuchs thinks the pictures of victim Brandy Peters' body are. It does show some blood spatter on the walls around her, the ceiling. There will be testimony about blood spatter. If that's the purpose for which he intends to introduce it, I don't think I would object to that. If it's not for that purpose, I wouldn't see any relevance to those pictures. With respect to the pictures of the kids in the tub, I absolutely object. Those pictures are not relevant to any material fact and issue at all. Nothing as part of the defense reconstruction testimony will touch on the kids being in the bathroom.
Let me see what photos we're talking about. They've been marked.
These are the initial photos we're talking about. There are going to be some more crime scene photos as it relates to things that are in addition to those. Those are the initial witnesses.
But what I was hoping is y'all were going to narrow it down to what pictures are actually objected to.
There were two in there. They're the only two. With respect to the kids, there's just two of them in the back that I object to both of those.
So I would take it the objection is to state's composite 6L and M. Those are two pictures you're talking about. Two of the.
I don't know the composite exhibit number, but if those are
These
those
two.
are two. Yes, sir.
All right. Mr. Hughes.
Your Honor, it's a crime scene. It's what law enforcement officers came into the home. It's what law enforcement officers found. There's going to be testimony from law enforcement officer Wyman that when he first came and cleared the house, that he was only able to see that there were two children in the bathtub, that he was actually told by witnesses outside that there was supposed to be a third, so he had to go back in and see the children. Your Honor, because time of death is an issue, there's clothing issues that are involved, how the children were found, all the things are relevant as far as where the children were found. I don't understand how a crime scene photo, we try to minimize them as much as possible, but how the children are found in the bathtub, in the manner in which they are, how it's not relevant. So I try to minimize them as much as possible, but I can't change the way that the children were found and the way by law enforcement officers.
Further, Mr. Prince?
Just to the extent that there is an issue of that nature that needs to be addressed, I think it would be more appropriately addressed through testimony. Again, those issues are not in dispute.
I'll overrule the objection. Further issues we need to resolve before we get into the testimony.
Not from the defense.
And Your Honor, I will show the video that's in question to Mr. French during the break, and he can renew any objections to already back.
Is it going to basically show the same thing?
Yes, sir. Would you like me to give you the disc as well so you can look at it?
Not particularly. Anything else?
No.
All right, we'll be in recess till 12:30.